approximate weight, age, events, injuries that they can see or discern, and the emergency room staff then gets out whatever we can, basically, in preparation for that. And we open up what we call the pediatric Breslow bag. Has different equipment designed for different sized infants, and there's all the medications. We look up the dosing based on the weight that we're given, and we have a lot of the information, kind of all the medications that we could possibly give are already drawn up and ready to go.
Can you give us an idea about what time she got to the emergency room that day and what you saw and did as a result of that, Dr. Fox?
Can I refer to my notes?
Yes, ma'am. Do you have some notes to refresh your memory?
Now, our first recorded time, I guess, 16:19. I guess when she arrived was approximately 16:19 or 4:19 in the afternoon.
All right.
That's when they brought her through the doors and put her in the first trauma bay.
Did you have contact with her at that point, ma'am?
Yes. And we're standing at the door with gloves on.
Ready for her to come in?
Pretty much.
And if you would, tell us what you go through then, what assessments that you make initially, and then what happens as she was brought into the emergency room.
Well, the basic things that you need to do as a child comes through the doorways, the first thing you do is you establish that the airway tube that they have is appropriate, working, good breath sounds, listen to heart, lungs, see if there's any activity. You do stop CPR briefly to see if there's any cardiac activity, anything on the monitor, any kind of pulses. Before you lose your paramedics, you're pulling everybody in that was possibly on scene, and you're asking them anything you can find out about them. You get good CPR going, and you get as much information as you can, and then you draw blood, do gases, get another line.
Now, in this case, you had some paramedics or EMTs from Bay County, but did you also have the air heart attendants? Did they actually brought her into the emergency room?
Right. I think the pilot stays with the helicopter, but we get the two of the air heart crew that comes in, and I get to ask them what things look like on scene.
Would you tell us what condition Adrianna Hutto was in when she actually came in the emergency room?
When we first got her, she was still in clothes. Essentially, some of it had been sort of cut away from her chest so they could do their compressions and such, but she was unresponsive. Her pupils were fixed and dilated. Her hair was still wet. She was kind of cold, pale.
What did you or the people around you then do, ma'am, to try to save this little girl's life that afternoon?
We try to warm them up. If they're cold, we try to warm them up. We use whatever we need to at that point, but if, sometimes just they come in via the ambulance, they get cooled off because they're wet or whatever. We try to put in we usually try to get in 2 or 3 good IV lines so that we can push our medications. We use what we call ACLS protocol, which means there's a certain list of what you do depending if they have a heart rate or if they don't. If they're breathing, you're basically breathing for them. You're doing CPR, which means you're compressing their chest and pumping their heart for them, establishing that has a good pulse, checking oxygen levels. We do blood gases, send off labs, chest x-ray.
Did you see any improvement, or were you able to actually get a heartbeat or a pulse rate that afternoon, ma'am?
After we'd gone through about probably almost between 8 to 10 medications, dosing of bicarb, epinephrine, adrenaline, these kind of medications that we use. And we did get some cardiac activity back. I actually got a pulse without compressions, and I thought we were going to bring her back.
I believe at some point you say you quit the chest compressions and she was placed on a ventilator. Is that right?
We had her on she was intubated from the time she came through the door, and she always had somebody either breathing for her or the machine was hooked up to her. And we were trying to get the machine hooked up to her when she started having spontaneous pulse back. We were trying to put her on a established machine so that we could get we could get her ready to stabilize and transfer her. And at that point, I'd already been in contact with Tallahassee Memorial in the phone in the room, and I'd been talking to a critical care pediatrician that I like to refer to and ask questions to.
So you had this spontaneous pulse there, and can you give us an idea of how long that lasted, Dr. Fox?
Not long enough for me to, she had a pulse, and I looked up and I talked to the people in the room, and I was going to leave the room to talk to the pediatrician to set up transfer. And I just got him on the phone when she lost her pulse again. It hadn't been 2 or 3 minutes.
And what happened after that, ma'am?
We went back to kind of square one, doing CPR, compressing her chest, pounding on her heart to get it to work. And it just, a repeat gas showed that her oxygen level kept dropping. It became harder and harder to push air into her lungs. We had to take her back off the vent because it wasn't successful, and we had to do it manually to sort of push enough pressure to open up her lungs.
Were you able to get that heart started again, Dr. Fox?
We had some electrical activity, but we never got a pulse again.
Can you give these ladies and gentlemen an idea of how long you and the other staff worked to try to save her life once she got to the emergency room?
It was at least an hour of doing, I won't, even if I don't think that there's a very good chance of.
Around, I believe, around 5:05 or somewhere right around that area, a little after that, you finally pronounced her dead.
It was roughly an hour. We know that, and I'm not going to call a child dead until we've worked on her at least an hour.
Okay. Now, Dr. Fox, did you notice any injuries to this child's head when she came into the emergency room that afternoon?
I did, actually, and we were trying to, we roll them and look quickly to see what's going on, just to see if there's any extraneous injuries or activity or whatever. And one of the things that you do for Son is to take off the rest of her clothes so that we can see what's going on, that we have access to her femoral arteries, access to her brachial arteries. But in doing so, we also check for other trauma to make sure we're not missing something. And I didn't see anything on the back. I didn't see anything, but there were bruising. It was actually red marks when she first came on her forehead, and there was some reddish to light purple marks on her right shoulder.
I'd like to show you a couple of photographs again. Could you step down over here, Doctor? Come right over here, ma'am. And there's a camera. We're going to be able to put these up so the jury can see those. I'll show you photograph 4B. And if you would, ma'am, use this pencil and point out to us any injuries or the areas where you notice these red marks, ma'am.
This, the bruising here, here, and here it wasn't as purplish initially as it was later.
All right. We have another photograph 4E.
And it's still going to be the same. There's the bruising along the forehead.
4H.
This actually looks just, there's this redness that you might notice back here is what they call livido, or after a person's died, the blood settles posteriorly. But there was a pretty good red mark here that became more purplish.
Photograph 4J.
Mostly the red mark that was out here was there. Now, there's some marks here. I don't specifically remember them offhand, but we also had to do CPR, and through a prolonged period of keeping your
Chest compressions.
doing chest compressions with continuous activity, that never ended up making any bruising.
All right. Now, doctor, in your experience here, you said these the redness or the marks that you saw on the forehead, they were not this color when you first saw them.
They were a little bit more red, but I do remember that when she first got here, you predominantly saw one streaking red mark with the second one here. This actually came up to be more obvious later, but these two, it's just...
Those were the most dominant ones.
Those were the most dominant ones.
In your experience, can you give us an idea? Did these look like recent injuries or fresh injuries, ma'am?
Just for the course of what I witnessed, I would say that yes, that does had to have happened roughly before or shortly during the time around that she was brought in.
When Adrianna was in your care that afternoon, did you see any life-saving techniques or measures that would have caused any of this bruising to this child's head?
I did not. I don't. On adults, there's a tape that will go across the forehead to secure their head to a backboard. In her case, she was small enough that the neck support that we had initially got her in was enough to secure that, and putting that much apparatus on her basically obscures so that you can't get to the airway or get to the child.
So that's the reason that you don't put a child on a board such as that or on a device such as that?
Well, there's pediatric life boards, and it's just not, it wasn't necessary in her particular case.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Fox, after you made the decision that the life-saving efforts were unsuccessful, what did you do in regard to this child?
During any kind of resuscitative efforts, we always try to look for family to get more information, the story, medical problems, allergies, whatever. But it wasn't, it was known that this was a life flight in from an outlying county, and it would be a while before we got family. But after it just became obvious that there wasn't going to be anything further I could do, we called the code and I looked for family.
Were you able to meet with any of her relatives or her mother?
I was told that it was her mother and I think it was her mother's boyfriend that it was introduced to me.
And did you tell her what you had done and that her daughter had died?
I tried to inform them as gently as possible that there was nothing else left to do. We had done everything in our best efforts, and I was afraid that her daughter had died.
Okay. Now, you were the one that actually told her that her daughter had died. Is that correct?
I believe so.
And from talking with other witnesses, I understand that was an emotional time for you. I would, if you remember, ma'am, what was the mother's demeanor when you told her that?
It actually was, it struck me odd because it was almost calming to me to look into her eyes, and she didn't really have much of a reaction, and it just was very flat.
Unemotional.
I remember it distinctly because I was thinking it was better that she didn't.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fox.
Mr. Smith?
Dr. Fox, to the best of your recollection, when did you have that contact with the mother and tell her the bad news? Do you know what time that was?
I can tell you the code was called at probably 5 after or lose her air tube.
So where does the strap go? Does it go across the top of the head, or where do they actually fasten it to?
For her, she actually had a strap that kind of went across the top of her head, but it didn't stick to her. On the adults, there's actually a piece of tape that you have to pull off kind of slowly, or it'll take hair with you.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mr. Bass?
And doctor, when you said across the top of the head, you're not talking about up here on the forehead.
It was kind of across the top. It comes down because it has to secure to the outside, and it goes past the body to the board, which is usually quite a bit outside their shoulders.
Thank you. No further questions. May this witness be released.
Mr. Smith, any additional questions?
No, sir.
All right.